Chapter 1. The Deadly Defect. At 23,000 feet over the Akhtubinsk test range, Major Valentin Privalov felt his MiG-21 begin the unmistakable shudder. The stick was vibrating against his palm. Not the normal high-altitude buffet. Something else. Something wrong. The horizon tilted past his bubble canopy. Once, twice, 3 times per second and accelerating. His altimeter was unwinding through 22,000 feet. The G-forces pinned him against his ejection seat at an angle that made reaching the throttle difficult. The smell of hydraulic fluid mixed with his own sweat inside the pressure suit. Privalov had 247 hours in the MiG-21 program. He knew exactly what was happening because he'd watched it kill 7 men in 18 months. Flat spin, high altitude, unrecoverable. The first man to die was Lieutenant Colonel Georgy Mosolov. December 11th, 1962. Privalov had been in the observation tower when Mosolov's MiG-21 prototype entered the spin at 25,000 feet. They watched him follow the emergency procedure perfectly. Full opposite rudder, stick forward to break the stall, throttle to idle. The aircraft continued rotating. At 15,000 feet, Mosolov's voice came over the radio, calm and professional, reporting he couldn't stop the rotation. At 8,000 feet, his canopy separated. His body was found 2 kilometers from the impact crater. The investigation report said aerodynamic coupling between rudder authority and center of gravity shift at high altitude creates unrecoverable spin condition. What it meant was the manual was wrong. The procedure didn't work. Following orders killed you. 3 months later, Captain Boris Adrianov died exactly the same way. March 8, 1963. Same altitude, same textbook recovery attempt, same accelerating spin that wouldn't stop. Adrianov held on longer. He was still trying to recover at 4,000 feet when his aircraft augured into frozen ground at 400 miles per hour. The impact was so violent, they couldn't identify which pieces of wreckage had been aircraft and which had been pilot. Chief designer Artem Mikoyan personally banned all intentional spins above 15,000 feet after that. Technical Bulletin 2109 went out to every squadron. High-altitude spin recovery prohibited pending aerodynamic analysis. But American F-4 Phantoms didn't care about Soviet technical bulletins. They engaged at 20,000 to 30,000 feet over Vietnam. Soviet intelligence reports showed MiG-21 pilots entering defensive breaks at combat altitude and never pulling out, their aircraft falling in the same flat spin that haunted Akhtubinsk every winter. The mathematics were brutal. At 25,000 feet, a MiG-21 in flat spin descended at 4,000 feet per minute while rotating 3 times per second. Minimum safe ejection altitude was 6,000 feet. That gave you 4 minutes and 45 seconds to solve a problem that had a 1% fatality rate. Now Privalov's world was rotating. The instrument panel blurred. The altimeter showed 21,000 feet. His training said apply full opposite rudder, push the stick forward, reduce throttle to idle. Standard recovery procedure. What every test pilot learned at Chkalov Air Force Academy. Privalov had watched that procedure kill everyone who tried it above 15,000 feet. His right hand was locked on the stick. His left hand was on the throttle. The horizon spun past his canopy 4 times, 5 times. The rotation was accelerating. At this rate, he'd be unconscious from the G-forces in another 20 seconds. At 20,000 feet, he had maybe 3 minutes before he either recovered or ejected. If he ejected, the program would lose another test pilot, another aircraft, and the MiG-21 would remain unflyable at combat altitude. If he followed the manual, he'd be dead before he reached 10,000 feet. The altimeter showed 19,000 feet. Privalov's hand moved to the throttle, not to reduce power, to add it. Chapter 2. The Accidental Discovery. Privalov's hand moved to the throttle, not to reduce power, to add it. His training screamed at him. 7 other voices screamed louder. Mosolov's calm report at 15,000 feet that the rotation wouldn't stop. Adrianov's last transmission before the radio went silent. 5 more names on the memorial wall at Akhtubinsk who'd followed procedure perfectly and died anyway. The throttle stayed at idle. His right hand locked on the stick. The horizon spun past his canopy 5 times, 6 times. The altimeter showed 18,000 feet. His peripheral vision was graying. The pressure suit squeezed his legs, forcing blood toward his brain, but the G-forces from rotation were winning. Another 30 seconds, and he'd black out. After that, it wouldn't matter what he did. The standard procedure ran through his mind like a recording. Power to idle. Check. Ailerons neutral. Check. Full opposite rudder. Check. Stick forward to break the stall. Check. The MiG-21 continued spinning. 17,000 feet. Privilov's left hand was shaking on the throttle. He'd spent 8 months as a test pilot specifically on the MiG-21 program before this. He'd watched the spin problem kill men better than him. He'd studied the wind tunnel data that showed why the standard recovery failed at high altitude. The delta wing created a vortex pattern that blanketed the tail surfaces. No airflow meant no control authority. The rudder was just a piece of metal in dead air. The elevator was useless. The only thing spin recovery procedure accomplished above 15,000 feet was giving pilots something to do while they waited to die. 16,000 feet. 8 rotations per second now. The instrument panel was a blur. He could only read the altimeter when it swept past directly in front of his face. He thought about Mosolov, not the crash. The conversation 3 weeks before. They'd been in the design bureau arguing with the aerodynamicists about the spin problem. One of the engineers said the issue was insufficient tail authority during rotation. Mosolov had asked a question nobody could answer. What if we're trying to stop the rotation when we should be trying to change the flight path first? The engineer said that made no sense. You stop the spin, then you recover from the dive. That's the procedure. That's the physics. Mosolov died 2 weeks later following that physics. 15,000 feet. Privilov's vision was tunneling. His training said eject, minimum safe altitude. The program couldn't afford to lose another pilot and another aircraft, but if he ejected, the next pilot would face the same choice: follow the procedure and die, or find another way. His left hand moved. The throttle came forward, not to military power, all the way to the stop. Full throttle. The Tumansky R-11 turbine screamed. The noise was deafening even through his helmet. Every manual, every regulation, every lesson at Chkalov Academy said this would make everything worse. The spinning crankshaft would create additional gyroscopic forces. The torque would pitch the nose up. The engine thrust would flatten the spin and make recovery impossible. 14,000 feet. Nothing changed. The rotation continued, 8 times per second. The G-forces squeezed harder. Privilov's right hand felt like it weighed 40 pounds. Then the nose dropped. Not much, maybe 1 degree, but it dropped. The exhaust from the engine was creating a different airflow pattern over the tail, not the calm, separated flow that made the control surfaces useless. Turbulent, chaotic flow, but flow, movement. Air hitting the horizontal stabilizer at an angle instead of flowing smoothly past it. 13,500 feet. The rotation slowed, 7 times per second. Still spinning, still falling, but slower. Privilov drove the stick forward, hard, the same motion Adrianov had tried and failed. But Adrianov hadn't had engine thrust changing the airflow. Adrianov had followed the manual. The nose dropped 5 degrees. The MiG-21's vertical stabilizer came out of the stalled vortex enough to generate sideways force. Not much, but enough. Privilov had full left rudder pedal to the floor. That rudder had been useless at 18,000 feet when the tail was in dead air. Now it was in turbulent air from the engine. Turbulent air was better than no air. 12,500 feet. 5 rotations per second. He could read his instruments now. Artificial horizon showing 60 degrees bank. Vertical speed indicator pegged at maximum descent. Airspeed climbing through 180 knots. The rotation was converting to a spiral dive. 11 meters 800 feet. 3 rotations per second. The physics were working in ways the manual said they shouldn't. The engine thrust wasn't just creating airflow over the tail. It was accelerating the aircraft's descent, increasing the relative wind over the wings, starting to create enough airspeed to begin unstalling the delta wing. 11,000 feet. The rotation stopped, not gradually, all at once. The horizon steadied in his canopy. The G-forces from rotation vanished, replaced by the 4 Gs of a 50-degree dive at 250 knots. The stall warning light went dark. His MiG-21 was flying again. Privilov pulled back on the stick. 5 Gs, 6. The altimeter bottomed at 9,200 feet and started climbing. He leveled at 12,000 feet. Throttle back to cruise. Hands locked on the controls to stop them shaking. His pressure suit was soaked with sweat. His right shoulder ached from fighting the control stick. The smell of hydraulic fluid mixed with burned jet fuel from running full throttle in a spin. He'd just violated every regulation in the test pilot manual and survived something that had killed 7 men. The radio crackled. Test 7, Akhtubinsk Tower. We observed your spin entry. Confirm you recovered. Privalov looked at his fuel gauge. He'd burned through 400 kilograms in the spin. Still had 1,100 kilograms remaining. Engine instruments all green. Hydraulics normal. Flight controls responding. He'd just proven that everything they taught about high-altitude spin recovery was wrong. But proving it once meant nothing. It could have been luck, random turbulence, a gust that caught the tail at exactly the right moment. Tower Test 7. I recovered at 9,200 feet using non-standard procedure, requesting permission to climb to 20,000 and attempt second spin entry to verify recovery method. Silence. 10 seconds. 20. Then Senior Lieutenant Colonel Kozlov's voice, tight with something between anger and disbelief. Test 7. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Do not attempt any further spins. Acknowledge. Privalov's thumb hovered over the transmit button. He could follow orders. Land. File a report. Let the engineers analyze what happened. Let them decide if it was repeatable, or he could climb back to 20,000 feet and find out if he'd discovered something or just gotten lucky once. The altimeter showed 12,000 feet. The tower was 30 kilometers away. His fuel gave him another 40 minutes of flight time, enough time to either prove the method worked or become the 8th name on the memorial wall. His hand moved to the throttle. Chapter 3. Secret Transmission. Revised. Privalov didn't climb back to 20,000 feet. He turned toward the airfield, throttle at cruise, and thought about how to tell Senior Lieutenant Colonel Kozlov that he'd just disobeyed physics. The landing gear thumped down at 14:47 local time. By 15, he was in the debriefing room with Kozlov, 2 engineers from the Mikoyan Design Bureau, and Captain Yevgeny Karchenko, the only other test pilot who'd survived a high-altitude spin in the past year. Karchenko had ejected at 7,000 feet. He'd followed procedure. Kozlov sat behind a metal desk with Privalov's flight data recorder tapes spread in front of him. His voice was flat, controlled. Explain why you added power in a flat spin when you knew it contradicts approved recovery procedures, Privalov explained, the engine exhaust creating turbulent airflow over the tail, the turbulent air giving the control surfaces authority, the nose dropping enough to begin unstalling the wing. Kozlov listened without expression. The 2 engineers listened with expressions that suggested they were hearing a man rationalize luck. The senior engineer spoke first. Major, the turbulence from engine exhaust is unpredictable. It cannot create consistent control authority. You experienced a favorable air current at the exact moment you added power. Coincidence, not cause. Then let me prove it's repeatable, Privalov said. Absolutely not, Kozlov said. You violated standing orders. You could have destroyed a test aircraft. If you're wrong, we lose both the method and the pilot testing it. Karchenko leaned forward. He was 28. Had been watching the spin problem kill pilots for 18 months. Permission to speak, Colonel. Kozlov nodded. Let me try it, Karchenko said quietly. If it works, we have something. If it doesn't, we know the Major got lucky once. The senior engineer shook his head. The physics don't support this. Engine thrust creates nose-up pitching moment in a flat spin. Adding power should worsen the condition. Mosolov said something 3 weeks before he died, Privalov said. He said maybe we were trying to stop the rotation when we should be trying to change the flight path first. The room went silent. Kozlov looked at the flight data tapes for a long time. I need authorization from Moscow for any additional testing. That takes time. How much time? Karchenko asked. Weeks, maybe longer. That night, Privalov was in the officers' mess, staring at cold tea, when Karchenko sat down across from him. Tomorrow morning, 06 Selizer, I filed a flight plan for high-altitude handling characteristics. Kozlov approved it, Privalov asked. Kozlov is in Moscow for 3 days. Lieutenant Shevchenko is signing off on routine test flights. He's 24 and doesn't question test pilots. Privalov looked at him. If it doesn't work, they blame me for ignoring procedure. If it does work, we teach it quietly before Moscow decides admitting the old procedure was wrong is politically inconvenient. Karchenko leaned closer. Intelligence reports from Vietnam say American pilots are exploiting our spin problem. They force MiG-21s into high-altitude turns. Watch them stall, watch them spin. They have a name for it. What name? They call our aircraft the flying coffin above 18,000 feet. The next morning at 06:43, Privalov stood in the observation tower watching Karchenko's MiG-21 climb to 22,000 feet. At 06:51, the aircraft entered a deliberate spin. Privalov counted rotations through binoculars. 5, 10, 15. His hands were locked on the tower railing. The MiG-21 was falling. The radio crackled. Karchenko's voice strained. Spin established. Altitude 19,000. Attempting power-on recovery. 20 seconds passed. The MiG-21 continued spinning, descending through 17,000 feet. Privalov's throat was dry. If Karchenko died, it would be because Privalov had convinced him to try something that might have just been luck. 30 seconds. 16,000 feet. Then the nose dropped. The rotation slowed. The aircraft transitioned to a controlled spiral. 5 seconds later, Karchenko pulled out at 13,800 feet and climbed back to cruise altitude. Recovery successful. Karchenko's voice was steady now, requesting permission to attempt second spin to verify repeatability. Lieutenant Shevchenko hesitated on the radio. Test 4. You're cleared. Maintain minimum recovery altitude of 10,000 feet. Karchenko spun twice more that morning, recovered both times. Different altitudes each time because he varied when he applied power, but every attempt worked. That evening, Karchenko found Privalov in the ready room. He had a notebook. I wrote down everything. Entry altitude, rotation rate, when I added power, when the nose dropped, recovery altitude. If we're going to teach this, we need to know what works and what doesn't. Over the next 4 days, while Kozlov was in Moscow, 3 more test pilots tried the technique. 2 succeeded on their first attempt. 1 panicked, added power too late, and had to eject at 6,800 feet. He survived. The MiG-21 didn't. When Kozlov returned the following Monday, word had already spread through the test squadron. 7 successful recoveries. 1 aircraft lost, but the pilot survived instead of both dying. Kozlov called Privalov into his office. I've been told several pilots conducted unauthorized spin testing during my absence. Yes, Colonel. I've also been told most of them survived using your technique. 6 out of 7, Colonel. 1 pilot waited too long to add power, but he ejected successfully. Under the old procedure, he'd be dead. Kozlov opened a folder. Inside were handwritten notes, Karchenko's documentation, entry parameters, recovery steps, success rates. Captain Karchenko compiled this. He says the technique works if applied above 15,000 feet. Below that, standard procedure is sufficient. Above that, power-on recovery is the only method with survival data. He closed the folder. I'm forwarding this to the Design Bureau. Officially, it will be reviewed as a proposed refinement to existing procedures. Unofficially, you and Karchenko just prevented an unknown number of pilots from dying the same way Mosolov did. What happens to us, Colonel? Privalov asked. Medals. Also reprimands for unauthorized testing. The medals will be announced. The reprimands will not. Kozlov looked at him directly. Moscow cannot admit the original procedures were flawed without explaining why pilots died following them. But they also cannot ignore a technique that keeps pilots alive. So they'll classify it as an advanced procedure for experienced pilots only. Do you understand? Privalov understood. No admission of failure, no public correction, just a quiet update that would save lives while protecting reputations. Yes, Colonel. 6 weeks later, a supplemental training bulletin went to MiG-21 squadrons. It described power-on recovery as an alternative technique for specific high-altitude spin conditions. It didn't say the standard procedure had killed pilots. It didn't mention names. It didn't explain why this hadn't been taught from the beginning. But between March 1964 and the end of 1965, pilots who'd learned the technique from other pilots, quietly, in ready rooms and over drinks, never officially, started surviving spins that would have killed them months earlier. Intelligence reports from Vietnam changed. American pilots noticed MiG-21s recovering from situations that should have been fatal. The reports noted improved Soviet pilot training and possible aircraft modifications. It wasn't training. It wasn't modifications. It was one test pilot who'd ignored orders and a network of pilots who'd taught each other to survive before Moscow could decide whether saving lives was politically acceptable. Nobody kept official statistics on how many pilots the technique saved. That would have required admitting how many the old procedure had killed. But the memorial wall at Akhtubinsk didn't get any new names for high-altitude spin accidents after 1964. The pilots knew why. Chapter 4. Legacy Revised. On March 18, 1975, Major Valentin Privalov stood at the edge of the Akhtubinsk airfield, watching a young pilot walk away from a crashed MiG-21. The pilot's name was Lieutenant Alexei Volkov. He was 24 years old. He just survived a flat spin at 21,000 feet by adding power when every instinct told him not to. He'd recovered at 11,500 feet, but his landing gear had malfunctioned from the stress. The belly landing had destroyed the aircraft, but Volkov was alive. Privalov watched the emergency crews foam the wreckage. 11 years had passed since he'd first discovered the power-on recovery technique. In that time, he'd moved from test pilot to instructor, from captain to major, from anonymous problem solver to someone pilots occasionally approached after briefings to say, "Thank you for the thing you figured out that time." They never said it officially. There were no award ceremonies, no formal recognition, just quiet acknowledgments between pilots who understood that following procedure sometimes meant dying, and breaking procedure sometimes meant living. Volkov approached him. The young pilot's flight suit was torn at the shoulder where the ejection seat harness had dug in during the G-forces. His hands were still shaking slightly. "Major Privalov, they told me you were the one who taught the technique to other test pilots." "Yes," Privalov said. He'd learned over the years to frame it that way. Not discovered, not invented, just taught. It made the bureaucrats more comfortable, made it sound like he'd simply passed along information rather than contradicted years of approved doctrine. Volkov nodded. "Captain Belov taught me. He said he learned it from you in 1967, said you'd figured it out the hard way." The hard way. That was accurate. Privalov thought about the 7 seconds at 15,000 feet in 1964 when his hand had moved to the throttle despite everything his training told him. About Mosolov, who'd asked the right question 3 weeks before he died but hadn't lived to see the answer work. About Karchenko, who'd risked his life to prove the technique wasn't just luck. "You did it correctly," Privalov said. "You recovered above 10,000 feet. That means you added power early enough." "I panicked," Volkov said. "Thought I'd waited too long, almost ejected at 13,000. But you didn't. You trusted the technique." Volkov looked at the destroyed MiG-21. "They're going to court-martial me for destroying the aircraft." "No," Privalov said. "They're going to write a report saying you experienced mechanical failure during routine flight testing. The spin will be mentioned as a contributing factor, not the cause. Your recovery will be noted as successful emergency procedure. Nobody will ask about the details." "How do you know?" "Because that's how it works now," Privalov said. 11 years ago, they would have court-martialed you for not following standard procedure. Now they pretend the technique you used is standard procedure. They just don't teach it formally. That afternoon, Privalov sat in his office and did something he hadn't done in years. He tried to count how many pilots might have survived using power-on recovery. He knew of maybe 30 cases personally, pilots who'd approached him, or pilots he'd heard about through other instructors. But the technique had spread far beyond people he knew. Karchenko, now a training squadron commander in the Ukraine, had written him 6 months earlier. The letter mentioned at least a dozen pilots in his command who'd used the technique successfully. A test pilot from Zhukovsky had mentioned hearing about it from a MiG-21 pilot who'd served in Egypt. Another instructor from Chkalov Academy said the technique was being taught informally to advanced students, passed from experienced pilots to new ones, never appearing in official curricula. How many pilots? 50? 100? Privalov had no way to know. The technique had taken on a life of its own, spreading through the Soviet Air Force's pilot network like knowledge always spread when survival was at stake, quietly, personally, from those who knew to those who needed to know. He thought about Parker's method from the American archives he'd read in a classified intelligence briefing. An American gunner who'd figured out extreme deflection shooting in 1943, taught it to other gunners unofficially, saved dozens of lives. The official U.S. Navy had eventually adopted the technique, but never gave Parker full credit. The pattern was universal. Pilots figured out what worked. They shared it with each other. Command eventually acknowledged it, but only after pretending it had been the plan all along. In 1982, Privalov retired from active flying. He was 49, had logged over 3,000 hours, had served as a test pilot, combat instructor, and technical advisor to the Design Bureau. His service record mentioned contributions to flight safety procedures and pilot training improvements. Specific details were classified. He stayed involved in aviation as a consultant. Over the years, he watched the MiG-21 evolve. New variants, better engines, improved avionics. But the basic airframe remained the same, which meant the spin characteristics remained the same, which meant pilots still needed the technique he'd discovered in 1964. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, many military archives were declassified or destroyed. Privalov spent 3 days at Akhtubinsk going through old test pilot reports. He found his own report from February 1964. The section describing the spin recovery had been marked "Technique under review, not approved for general training." Someone had added a note in 1967, now incorporated into advanced procedures. No mention of his name, no mention of Karchenko. Just a bureaucratic notation that the thing that had killed 7 men before him was now considered an acceptable recovery method. He also found something else, a report from 1963 describing Moselov's fatal spin. In the margins, someone, probably an engineer, had written a question. Should investigate whether standard recovery procedure is sufficient for high-altitude scenarios. Mosolov had died in December 1963. That note was dated 3 weeks earlier. Someone had identified the problem. Someone had suggested investigating alternatives. And then bureaucracy or workload or simple inertia had prevented action until 7 more pilots died and 1 desperate test pilot ignored his training. Privalov kept that page. He never showed it to anyone. But sometimes, late at night, he'd look at it and think about how many pilots might have survived if someone had listened to that engineer in 1963 instead of waiting until 1964. Years passed. Privalov grew older. The MiG-21 was gradually retired from frontline Soviet service, replaced by newer aircraft with better handling characteristics and computer-assisted flight controls. The flat spin problem became less common as aircraft design evolved, but other air forces still flew MiG-21s. India, Vietnam, Syria, Egypt, dozens of others. And in those air forces, the technique continued to spread. Indian pilots taught it to each other. Syrian pilots who'd learned it in the 1970s taught it to the next generation. A Pakistani exchange pilot who'd trained in Russia brought it back to his squadron. Nobody remembered where it came from. It was just something the instructors taught us, or a technique the Russians use, or what you do if standard recovery doesn't work. In 2024, India retired its last operational MiG-21 after 63 years of service. At the retirement ceremony, several pilots were interviewed about their experiences with the aircraft. One of them, a retired wing commander who'd flown MiG-21s for 20 years, mentioned a spin recovery technique that saved my life twice, though I never could find where it was written in the manual. Valentin Privalov died 3 months later, in December 2024, at age 91. He'd outlived the aircraft he'd test piloted by 6 months. His obituary in the military veterans newspaper mentioned his service as a test pilot, his technical contributions, his work as an instructor. It said he'd contributed to improvements in pilot training and flight safety procedures during the early development of Soviet jet fighter programs. 32 people attended his funeral. Most were family. A few were retired pilots who'd served with him at various points over his 40-year career. One was Yevgeny Karchenko, now 82, who'd been the first pilot to verify that power-on recovery wasn't just luck. Karchenko gave a short speech. He mentioned serving with Privalov at Akhtubinsk in the 1960s. He said Privalov had taught him that understanding why procedures exist matters more than blindly following them, and knowing when they don't work can save your life. None of the attendees knew Karchenko was describing a specific moment in 1964 when both men had risked their careers to prove a technique that would eventually spread through air forces around the world. After the service, a young aviation historian approached Karchenko. She was researching MiG-21 safety improvements in the 1960s. She asked if he knew anything about changes to spin recovery procedures during that period. Karchenko looked at Privalov's grave. Then he looked at the historian. There was a test pilot, he said carefully, who figured out something that saved a lot of lives. Command eventually adopted it, but they never gave him credit. That's how it worked back then. Do you remember his name? Karchenko glanced at the grave marker one more time. "You're standing next to it." The historian wrote down the name. She published a paper 6 months later noting that Soviet archives referenced spin recovery procedure modifications in 1964, possibly linked to testing at Akhtubinsk. The paper suggested that pilot-initiated innovation may have played a larger role in Soviet aviation safety improvements than official records indicate. The paper received minimal attention. It was a footnote in the MiG-21's 6-decade history, an aircraft that served in more conflicts than almost any other fighter, that was both celebrated and criticized, that killed and saved pilots in roughly equal measure. But pilots who'd flown MiG-21s read the paper and recognized the pattern, a technique nobody could trace to a specific source, a procedure that worked but took years to be officially acknowledged, a solution that spread pilot to pilot because waiting for command approval meant attending funerals. That's how it works sometimes. The innovations that save the most lives are often the ones nobody can credit to a single person. The techniques that matter most spread quietly between people who need them to survive long before official manuals admit they exist. And the pilot who figures it out first usually dies before anyone thinks to ask his name. Except this time, he didn't.